I think you're sitting in sequence. So.
I just work here.
Okay.
Bravo.
I think that's me.
That is you.
Well, good afternoon to all of you. I'm Lee Hamilton. I'm the president of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and welcome each of you to the program this afternoon. I know others will be coming in as we proceed. It is, of course, a high privilege for me to open the discussion on the legacy of a man who was one of our really great public servants of this and his generation, or I suppose any generation. He surely ranks among the most eloquent American political leaders, and I could not resist the opportunity to share with you a few quotes that have impressed me. His comments on national responsibility, I quote, "I venture to suggest that what we mean is a sense of national responsibility which will enable America to remain master of her power, to walk with it in serenity and wisdom, with self-respect and the respect of all mankind, a patriotism that puts country ahead of self, a patriotism which is not short, frenzied outbursts of emotion, but the tranquil and steady dedication of a lifetime. These are words that are easy to utter, but this is a mighty assignment, for it is often easier to fight for principles than to live up to them." And then, of course, his great remarks upon accepting the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in 1952. Quote, "Let's face it, let's talk sense to the American people. Let's tell them the truth, that there are no gains without pains, that we are now on the eve of great decisions, not easy decisions, like resistance when you're attacked, but a long, patient, costly struggle which alone can assure triumph over the great enemies of man, war, poverty, and tyranny, and the assaults upon human dignity, which are the most grievous consequences of each." And of course, he had a sharp wit and a great sense of humor. And you all know this quote: "Democrats always enjoy it, and even a few Republicans enjoy it." Indeed, there are some Republicans I would trust with anything that is, except public office. He is the one man in politics today who strikes an authentically new and fresh note, said Arthur Schlesinger, and he also said he's one of the nicest men in public life. As a young politician, I drew inspiration from Adlai Stevenson, as of course did countless others. His legacy continues to inspire generations of Americans, and we certainly owe a debt of gratitude to Mr. Liebling and the authors of this volume for exposing admirers, both new and old, to Stevenson's myriad contributions to the 20th century. A founder of and later ambassador to the United Nations, a governor, a presidential candidate. He devoted his life, of course, to public service. He was decades ahead of his time in his approach to confronting nuclear weapons and arms control. His commitment to diplomacy, multilateralism, consensus building, and democracy earned him worldwide respect. We're very fortunate to have an extraordinary distinguished panel with us today, comprised of individuals who have contributed to this book and who can, of course, provide insight into the life of Adlai Stevenson, as very few people can. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who, like Stevenson, served with great distinction as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. His extraordinary diplomatic career spanned 5 decades, with tours of duty as ambassador in Russia, India, Israel, El Salvador, and Jordan. He's currently vice chairman of Hills and Company International Consultants. Mr. Ambassador, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lee, very much, both for your carefully chosen and I thought beautifully apt quotations from Adlai Stevenson, who we honor here today. And thank you for your kind introduction. My job is to be moderator. My concept of moderator is someone who very briefly introduces the speakers, who helps to moderate the question and answer period, who listens with great and studious intent and speaks as shortly as possible and tries to assure the others do the same. I had the distinct pleasure of being ambassador in New York well after Adlai Steven's time, but it gave me a tremendous opportunity to reflect on how badly the office had fallen. My sense is, having been a very junior officer in 1962 and sat in the back of the room on the 12th floor, while Adlai Stevenson, flanked by Charles Yost and Eleanor Roosevelt, planned out the work of the United Nations, my job in succeeding him many generations later was to come 1/4 of the way up to his standard. It was an enormously interesting and challenging job, and one where he set the model for all of us who followed. A model we'll never quite be able to emulate, but one that represents the highest in American diplomatic achievement by someone who we all now still remember with great affection and indeed with pride and honor. I had, too, the opportunity to be closely associated with a number of the panelists. I had the opportunity to work for Jim Goodby years ago and to work on a project that was close to Governor Stevenson's heart, to put together at the beginning of the Kennedy administration a draft of a comprehensive test ban treaty. Jim, as you all know, was instrumental over the years in doing everything possible to get that treaty accepted, and Jim, for my money, was one of the brains and indeed one of the instigators behind the partial test ban treaty, which was successfully concluded in those early days. Finally, Adlai Stevenson, as Lee has pointed out, was a man of unusual wit and intelligence. And indeed, in describing the job in New York, which I later inherited, he famously said that the job was 1/3 protocol, 1/3 alcohol, and 1/3 Geritol. It's a pleasure to start the proceedings this afternoon following Lee's introduction by asking Ed Elmendorf, who is the chairman of the United Nations Association National Capital Area Chapter, to come and say a few words. Ed is a friend. I have the honor to work with him in the United Nations Association of the United States. I ask Ed if he will be immediately followed by another old friend, Kaz Yost, son of Charles Yost, another old friend and colleague, and I have the pleasure and indeed a great opportunity to serve with him on the board of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. So in the small world department, I'm afraid we're a little bit incestuous here tonight, but I hope you will excuse that and listen with intent to our speakers. Ed, please.
Thank you very much, Tom. There's very little I could say beyond welcoming all of you to this wonderful forum on behalf of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. The event has a special poignancy for me because, perhaps a little like you too, Tom, I was assigned to the U.S. mission to the UN as a junior Foreign Service officer in the time of Adlai Stevenson. And Dick Gardner will also remember that. It happened also that in 1965, after I'd worked there, Stevenson requested that I have a second assignment at the U.S. mission to work as his personal assistant, which I did in the last months of his life. This gave me and gives me a special feeling about this event. That was a very difficult time. I will long remember the month of May 1965, just before Stevenson died on the streets in London. In that month, there were more sessions of the UN Security Council than there had been in any month in previous UN history. I'm sure that record has been broken since. But the stresses of U.S. engagement in Dominican Republic and in Vietnam took their toll on Stevenson at that time. I would also mention, as others have already, Stevenson's sense of humor. He spoke, picking up a little bit on what Tom said, of only having one stomach to give to his country. On that note, I would conclude, turn it over to Kaz Yost, encouraging all of you who are not members of the United Nations Association to join. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted as director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown to be a co-sponsor of this event. You're going to be hearing a lot of Stevenson anecdotes, and I would be remiss in not offering mine quickly before my chairman pulls me down. It occurs to me, looking at this panel, that only perhaps Senator Stevenson's acquaintanceship with his father predates my experience with Governor Stevenson. I was, with my sister, living in Paris in the mid-1950s as the son of a serving diplomat, and was informed by my parents that a great man was coming to cocktails that evening at the DCM's residence. And as a Foreign Service brat, my responsibility on that occasion was to serve food at the function. And so I dutifully, at age 8 or 9, went around with my platter of sandwiches, which diminished over the course of my tour of the room. There was only 1 or 2 left, and I was looking down at my platter, and this voice said to me, "Are you going to let me have one of those?" And that was my first encounter with Governor Stevenson. In later years, I reminded him of that story, and he said, "Well, I was probably hungry that evening." On that note, I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to let my sister speak to the other family intersections, but I would note that I had the wonderful experience of working in the United States Senate when Senator Stevenson so ably represented Illinois on the floor of the Senate, and it's a delight, a personal delight for me to be back in the room with him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaz and Ed, for your statements. It's now time for us to move on to the panel. Before we move to the panel, I just want to remind you, as you saw when you came in, that there are copies of the book and the corridor on the way out, which are available for your purchase and for signing. I'd like to note for all of you that the panelists will speak in the order in which they are lined up to my left, to your right here, and that each one of them will have 5 to 7 minutes to present recollections, ideas, and thoughts related to Governor Stevenson. In addition, we will then have a brief colloquy, or a colloquy of 5 or 6, if we can have that one, among the members of the panel on thoughts, ideas, and questions about what has been said, and then we will open up the question and answer and comment period to you all in the audience. And I will, because we will want to have a system for recognizing you, I will try to point you out, and you can address your questions to the panel as a whole or to individuals as you see fit, and we will try to end, as we had promised, promptly at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Our first panelist is Judge Alvin Liebling. He has been an administrative law judge. He's editor of The Lasting Legacy. He met Adlai Stevenson in 1947 as an undergraduate at Northwestern. He headed the Illinois college campaign for Stevenson for governor, later served in the military as a judge advocate, in the Department of Justice as an assistant U.S. district attorney, was regional counsel and then senior attorney at the EPA, and became an administrative law judge assigned to the Social Security Office of Hearings and Appeals in the Chicago area. And I think it would be no secret, Judge, to say that you are a primary motivating factor behind this book and getting us all together. And it's a delight to have you, and please go ahead.
Thank you for your kind remarks. Good afternoon to everyone. I wish to thank you for all attending and the sponsors and supporters of today's symposium and their leaders, the Honorable Lee Hamilton, our next door neighbor in Indiana, Ed Elmendorf, who I've heard so much about, and of course Kaz Yost, the great brother of Felicity. I still can't get over that list of all the posts that your father occupied and took you all along with. What an extraordinary education. I also want to thank Richard Griffiths, who's the program vice president for the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, to Edison Dick, who I've spoken to many times, the great son of Jane Dick, who I knew very well, Hope McGowan, who's in the audience and wrote a very nice preface to her father's chapter, Carl McGowan, Judge McGowan, to Paula Boland, who has worked so hard on this effort, and to Sarah Goosen. This event, as everybody has noted, commemorates the recent publication by Palgrave Macmillan, a division of St. Martin's Press, of the book Adlai Stevenson's Lasting Legacy, which I was privileged to edit. Thanks to the senator, and I express my appreciation, and to contribute portions. Significantly, it is also the time today of celebrating the birthday of the governor, who was born on February the 5th, 1900. It seems a long time ago, and yet for many, and not so many years back, of events like the Second World War, the Cuba Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the wars in the Far East, where Adlai and I became directly and indirectly involved, the fall of the Soviet state, 9/11, the Middle East wars, Darfur, and now Iran, a matter of contention. Now, it is what we can learn from all of this, and what this man Stevenson for use today, and on the eve of an election that can bring constructive change to our country and hope to the world. Now, about the book. It consists of a dozen interrelated chapters of statesmen, scientists, and compatriots who served with Adlai Stevenson II of Illinois. Included in the list are 5 of the panelists here today, exclusive of Ambassador Gardner, who is busy finishing his book on Italy, along with others such as prior Assistant Secretary of State Harlan Cleveland, UN Undersecretary General Brian Urquhart, Ambassador to the UN William Vanden Heuvel, Historian and Presidential Assistant Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Court of Appeals Judge Carl McGowan, Drs. Adele Simmons and Ken Heckler, Ambassador George Bunn, and physicist Sidney Drell. Recollections of Eleanor Roosevelt, my introduction in a prologue by my journalist friend Don Campbell, and former Senator Eugene McCarthy, who wanted to contribute a chapter, but unfortunately he's not with us any longer today in person, but certainly in spirit. These are all included. Adlai Stevenson, as you know, was Illinois' 33rd governor. He was twice Democratic presidential nominee a founder of the United Nations in San Francisco, and in 1961 to 1965, 4.5 years inclusive of the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. Permanent Representative to the UN. Included especially is an essay in this book written by the governor, which we achieved from the archives of the in one of the universities that has his papers. And it was written in 1957, revealing why he had urged a ban on further above-ground hydrogen bomb testing during his 1956 presidential campaign. And although this was a strongly opposed position by the President Eisenhower at the time, it's interesting to note, as did Adlai Stevenson, that 2 years later it was adopted and expanded upon by him and the administration. Now, Stevenson had had the courage simply to take that kind of a electoral risk today. As my friend Newton Minow says, who today could we expect would do a similar thing? But, as physicist Sidney Drell and Ambassador Goodby state in their chapter, that is the way it is with those that think of the long-term consequences of our actions. With his help and the UN in 1962, a treaty began banning all above-ground nuclear tests was finally signed, and then a nuclear nonproliferation treaty in 1970, relying on a testing ban and general nuclear disarmament, and a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1996, though not yet ratified by the U.S. Thus, the policy that Stevenson advocated survives. And the last link in its implementation could be close at hand, inclusive of important inspection rights that are included within it. Finally, in the book's epilogue, after a detailed look at the past, former U.S. Senator Adlai Stevenson III and Assistant Secretary of State Harlan Cleveland remind us of a better politics and patient diplomacy of Adlai Stevenson's time, which has continued until more recent times, and they urge that it be restored. While former Assistant Secretary of State Harlan Cleveland, who was also later ambassador to NATO, because of his recuperation, which doesn't permit him to be in attendance here, his former deputy at the State Department, Richard Gardner, is present to shed light on his lengthy chapter and incisive epilogues, as well to otherwise add commentary on the abiding usefulness of Stevenson's years at the UN, while Cleveland and Ambassador Gardner, played a corollary role in Washington. I particularly note his remarks on March the 8th, 2005, on receipt of the Friedman Award at Columbia University, respecting the continuing need for Stevensonian patience in seeking resolution of today's threats to the peace. I quote Ambassador Gardner. In his UN office just before the U.S. invasion, Chief UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix, with over 300 inspections at 230 Iraqi sites, told me we were on the brink of a terrible tragedy, an unnecessary war, because if he were given just 2 or 3 more months, he could confirm his growing conviction that there were no means of mass destruction weaponry in Iraq. Blix and I agreed that the threat of force had been necessary to get Saddam to let the inspectors return to Iraq, but that since Saddam was not permitting the inspectors to work freely,
Permitting.
You're running over.
he was now permitting. You've got it right. The inspectors to work freely, the invasion was a bad idea. Bill's advice was ignored. Blix's advice was ignored. His team of inspectors was dissolved after we invaded Iraq. A year later, the Bush administration's own inspectors confirmed the absence of weapons of mass destruction. Thus, patience was trumped and diplomacy seem not to have been allowed to conclude its task, as Blix, in the spirit of Stevenson, had strongly pleaded. Now, I have a little footnote. I'm not going to read it all, but essentially what it says is that today, after 5 years, we continue to be in Iraq, and we're talking about leaving. And this time, we need to be more resourceful and patient there as in other situations, and to exercise a truly international role. I then go on to say that the recent bipartisan plan of the Baker-Hamilton Iraq Study Group is fundamentally an acknowledgement of this, and choosing an effective way of assuring and enforcing as required the necessary benchmarks under that plan without broadening conflict or creating instability in the region is seen as the crux of the matter. So, in sum, whether considering health and sustenance or nuclear control and disarmament, Stevenson had a deep concern for the world's humanity and its survival. He had a studied passion for a more sensitive foreign policy for our country in a nuclear era that demanded peace, that emphasized consensus building and patient, collaborative diplomacy, not unilateral action and preemption. He believed that in a preeminent position, our example and assistance had the best opportunity for success in fostering democracy and security in a world desperately needing both. These themes are legacies as timely today as they were during Adlai Stevenson's historic period of public service. They offer insight and hope for change to help America restore its recent losses. That is what this book is about.
Thank you, Judge, very much. And now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Senator Adlai Stevenson III, the eldest son of Governor Stevenson. Former senator from Illinois, he's now board chairman of SC&M Investment Management. He graduated from Harvard College, served in the Marine Corps as a tank platoon commander in Korea, graduated from the Harvard Law School in 1957, joined the Chicago firm of Meyer Brown Platt, becoming a partner in 1966. He was elected with record-breaking margins to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1965 and served till 1967, and then as Illinois State Treasurer in 1967 to 70. He was the United States Senator from Illinois from 1970 to 1981. Senator.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. President Eisenhower appointed Robert Taft III ambassador to Ireland. And in Ireland, he enrolled his young daughter in school, and she was asked on her first day to rise and to say something about herself. And she said, "My grandfather was president of the United States. My great-grandfather was president of the United States. My grandfather was the United States senator. My father is the American ambassador. My name is Martha, and I'm a brownie." I'm very grateful to all of our hosts for this meeting, and you'll hear about political ideals and values which have served our country very well and have been exemplified by the life of another Midwesterner, Lee Hamilton. The Gov, as he was known to friends, was a product of World War I and the enlightened internationalism of Woodrow Wilson. He was an intellectual, but not like Wilson, a scholar. He was a peripatetic student of the world, forever exploring the markets and the favelas and the slums, the monuments, to learn how people lived, and their monuments and battlefields, their museums, to discover their past, always absorbing history, but from on the ground and in the real world. His perspective was from no ivory tower of scholasticism for armchair polemicists and strategists. It was devoid of ideology and dogma. His universe was the world, but the roots ran deep in central Illinois. Our political archive, which I'm trying to convert into another book, maybe Backley, records grandfather Adlai I, then a student, observing grandfather Jesse Fell propose to Stephen A. Douglas joint discussions with a lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. These became the debates, 3 hours each, 7 of them on one subject, the extension of slavery into the territories. Lincoln gave grandfather Jesse Fell his autobiography with which to promote his candidacy for president in the United States. The roots run deep. Wilson was an influence, but the inspiration was Abraham Lincoln, a constant presence in this family. In 1948, the Illinois Democratic Organization needed respectable candidates for U.S. Senator and governor to head off the approaching Republican tide. For the Senate, they endorsed Paul H. Douglas, an eminent professor of economics from the University of Chicago, and also a reform alderman of Chicago. Now, that's an oxymoron. And for the United States Senate, they proposed a diplomat, an architect of the United Nations, a New Deal bureaucrat, and a former senior official in the Navy and the State Departments during World War II and its aftermath. He had no political base. They decided in their wisdom that it was better to entrust the spoils of the governor's office to the unknown quantity than to the known reformer. That's how my father was nominated. No primaries. Primaries were a formality in those days, unto my days. I was the driver. Day in and day out, we canvassed the state, pressing the flesh, railing against the do-nothing Republican Congress in Washington, the corrupt Green administration in Springfield, and the flesh, the devil, and all the other enemies of the Democratic Party, from courthouse to square to Factory Gate, ward meetings at night in Chicago, where the refrain always went the straight Democratic ticket down to unto my time. When it was all over, he had won election by the largest margin in the history of Illinois. Up to that time, I beat it later. His campaign cost $157,035, which was a lot by our standards. Scotch-Irish, the Scotch predominated in my family. Good citizens poured into his administration as they had the New Deal and with the new frontier. They didn't bring endorsements from campaign contributors and political leaders, so Richard J. Daley, the legendary mayor of Chicago, was something of an exception. Many went on to high places in the Kennedy and Johnson administration. Not one of them went on to become a lobbyist. Not one of them went on to become a convict. There have been 3 since already who have. I had a meeting this morning with Bill Wirtz, who was one. He recalls, as a professor of law at Northwestern, receiving a telephone call from the governor-elect asking him to serve as chairman of the Liquor Control Commission. And Wirtz replies, "The what?" The liquor control? I don't know anything about liquor control. To which the governor-elect says, well, you know how to keep your hands out of other people's pockets, don't you? That's all you need to know. Wirtz went on, of course, to become Secretary of Labor. State government was reorganized, reformed. When the Gov was blocked in the legislature, he took his case to the people on radio, and he won, observing once that cleanliness was next to godliness, except in the Illinois legislature, where it was next to impossible. Can you imagine? They liked it. He was drafted by the 1952 convention. He started that after a brilliant welcoming address as the host of the convention. He started that presidential campaign at the convention. No money, no staff, no program. Only a sturdy band of volunteers. They collected dollars door to door, and they assembled at the Elks Club in Springfield, where they worked literally until they dropped, helping with the speeches and the position papers for that campaign. For the Gov, democracy was not a means to power. It was an end in itself. Trust the people with the truth, he said, all the truth. What wins is more important than who wins. He took out half-hour blocks of time for substantive, eloquent speeches to cheering partisans, 5-minute blocks of time for face-to-face talks with the American people. These campaigns of 52 and 56 were the first televised campaigns in our history. When the Republicans started advertising on television, he complained that the election of a president was not a contest between Palmolive and Colgate, whereupon his lifelong companion in arms, George Ball, who known to many of you, chimed in. He said, "Movie actors will someday run for president." And here we are in the Reagan building. In losing, he won the hearts and minds of people the world over. In the campaigns and throughout the Eisenhower interregnum, and with his volunteers, the titular leader of the Democratic Party laid the thematic and the programmatic foundations for the new frontier and the great society. Arthur Schlesinger called President Kennedy the executor of the Stevenson Revolution. The opposition did more than oppose. He was the U.S. representative to the United Nations when he died in 1965, just a couple of blocks from the site of our home in war-torn London in 1945. It was a nightly watering hole because we had access to the American commissary for great men laying the foundation for a new world order and peace for all time. The Gov was a peacemaker, but as Premier Clemenceau observed in 1919, and several of American founders had earlier, it's easier to wage war than to make peace. I suspect the contributors to this book, dear friends, companions in arms, keen observers, all harbor a hope that in being reminded of another politics and another politician, it may inspire some to follow and restore American values to American politics. Plans are afoot to create an international center on democracy at the farm, our home, in Libertyville, where we hope to bring practitioners and scholars together from the world to address challenges to democratic systems of government everywhere, and to keep the legacy lasting. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for your insightful and elegant words, and it's now my pleasure to call on an old friend, Richard Gardner, who is professor of law and international organization at Columbia Law School. He has been ambassador to Italy in the 70s and early 80s and to Spain in the 90s. He has been Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs at the time that Governor Stevenson was at the United Nations. Dick Gardner has worked on trade policy issues, has worked on international economic policy advice to the State Department, and was prominent in the 1992 Earth Summit at Rio. Dick, I look forward to your words, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Tom. You've heard some wonderful Adlai Stevenson quotations. As I was listening to them, I thought of one, which illustrates Adlai's somewhat bittersweet and sometimes cynical humor. Now, this may be apocryphal, but I was told by several people that during his 1952 campaign, at one campaign stop, he got off his little plane and saw a gentleman there with a big sign. Adlai Stevenson is the candidate of the thinking American. And Adlai looked at it and said, "Oh my God, now I know I've lost." I want to say a word about someone who could not be here, Harlan Cleveland, a truly great American who wrote a magnificent chapter in this book, which you'll want to read if you haven't already. He was an eloquent, imaginative protagonist of creative multilateralism, and I'm indebted to him because he gave me my first government job. I was chosen as one of his two deputies. The other deputy was a great person, Joseph Sisko, a career Foreign Service officer who unfortunately passed away just a year ago. So I was the non-career, and Joe was the career deputy to Harlan, and we worked constantly with Adlai and his team in New York. I think Adlai might have had a little something to do with my appointment. With all the arrogance of a 32-year-old, I had sent Adlai Stevenson in 1959 an article I wrote for the Foreign Policy Association called something like New Directions in U.S. Foreign Economic Policy. And I got back, miraculously, a handwritten note from him. And it said, "Dear Dick, with all this enlightenment, why is there so little light?" With a typical Adlai Stevenson, phrasing. And then, to my amazement, I was invited by Adlai to join him, George Ball, and David Bruce, and a Foreign Service officer named Bob Schetzel, at the home of Mary Lasker, a townhouse in New York, in the fall of 1960, to help prepare transition papers on foreign policy for President Kennedy. Adlai was hoping that, having been asked by Kennedy to do this, he would be Secretary of State. Alas, it was not to be. But that was quite an experience for a young a person like myself. And I have one recollection out of it. I had worked that summer of 1960 at the Rand Corporation with people like Herman Kahn, who were conjuring up great visions of strategic nuclear exchanges. And I happened to mention to this distinguished group that a new idea that had come out of the Rand Corporation group was the MIRV, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, so that a country that had MIRVed its missiles could use up only with a small portion of them and destroy the missiles, all the missiles on the other side. And I remember Adlai saying, "That is the worst idea I've ever heard." He just knew instinctively that that would be destabilizing in the nuclear arms race. By the way, I see here Paige Wilson, and I want to mention Tom Wilson, who Harlan brought in as sort of policy planner and speechwriter for all of us, including Adlai, and he made a wonderful contribution. Just what was Adlai Stevenson's lasting legacy at the United Nations? Well, of course, everyone thinks of his soaring eloquence and how he put down Valerian Zorin in the Cuban Missile Crisis when he refused to answer whether there were nuclear weapons in Cuba. And "I'm not in a courtroom, sir." And Adlai said, "You are in the courtroom of world opinion, and I'll wait for your answer until hell freezes over." And of course, everybody remembers that, and that was important. But what was equally important was that President Kennedy, with the strong support of Adlai and Harlan Cleveland, did not unilaterally declare the quarantine of Cuba. He decided to go to the Organization of American States so that at least the members of the hemisphere could endorse it and give it a degree of legitimacy. It was obviously the Security Council wouldn't, because the Soviet would veto it. But we went to another international institution, the OAS, and that helped give legitimacy to what otherwise might have been seen as a totally unilateral action. That would be my example of how to do these things, and Adlai would have drawn appropriate conclusions, as was pointed out, for Iraq. The article by Harlan Cleveland, the essay, tells you that Adlai's time was a bumpy one. It was a bumpy ride because he did not get along that well with some of the Kennedy entourage, particularly McGeorge Bundy and Walt Rostow. And he was asked, for example, to go before the UN with a cover story on the Bay of Pigs invasion, which turned out to be false, and he was humiliated by that. And in 1965, he desperately sought a way to negotiate on the Vietnam War, which was not appreciated either by Dean Rusk or the Lyndon Johnson. So it wasn't an easy time. However, I would answer the question of the lasting legacy as follows. First of all, Adlai really raised the intellectual level and moral authority of our participation in the UN. Under Adlai Stevenson, when the General Assembly was about to start, our posture was not a defensive crouch thinking, how can we stop things from happening? It was a very affirmative policy of what initiatives can we take this time, this year, to strengthen the United Nations and its system of institutions. And that was very important to those of us who worked with him. Another part of his legacy was raising the quality of the representatives at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Just think of who were representing us at the United Nations under Adlai Stevenson. This was his team. Francis Plimpton, his deputy, Charles Yost, the ambassador representative to the UN Security Council, Phil Klutznick, our ambassador to the Economic and Social Council, Jack Bingham, our ambassador to the Trusteeship Council, Sid Yates, Marietta Tree, our representative in the UN Human Rights Commission, and Jane Dick, I see Edison, her son here, to the Women's Rights Commission. We've never fielded a team of that quality before or since. It was incredible. And working with them, of course, was, for me, one of the experiences of my life I will always value. And by the way, just compare today, we haven't even filled the job of U.S. ambassador to the Security Council, Deputy Ray. It's empty, and the same thing with the ambassador to ECOSOC. So there's some lessons that might be remembered there. But the third and most important lasting legacy of Adlai Stevenson, and this is largely overlooked, was that in his 4-year period as ambassador, we had the greatest period of UN institution building ever, and these institutions remain today. Under Adlai, we created the UN Development Program, we created the World Food Program, we created the principles on outer space, which, by the way, validated legally our satellites, reconnaissance satellites, which gave us information of the closed society of the Soviet Union, also laid the basis for the World Weather Watch and satellite communications. We, for the first time, started ratifying human rights treaties. Under President Eisenhower, it was the decision had been made, we'll never ratify any human rights treaty. How a country treats its own citizens is not a proper subject of treaty making. That was what the Eisenhower administration said. Well, that was changed. We started ratifying human rights treaties, and it led eventually to the ratification of the Genocide Convention. And we launched the idea of a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which we gave to the Costa Ricans to put forward so it didn't look like a Cold War proposal by the U.S., and that was eventually done. And we institutionalized peacekeeping operations, which of course had begun in the Congo and UNEF, the UN Emergency Force, but began to make it a flexible call-up system encouraging countries to train and earmark units of their armed forces for UN peacekeeping. And we, for the first time, allowed U.S. military aid to be used to help countries prepare their peacekeeping contingents. And all of that now has mushroomed to the point where we have 100,000 UN military and police in well over a dozen operations in all parts of the world. This is a major contribution of the UN system. Now, the challenge to U.S. leadership today in the UN, let's be honest, is even harder than it was in Adlai's time. When I was serving with Adlai, there were 86 members of the UN. There are now 193. There's a so-called non-aligned movement which consists of 130 countries. Guess who's the chairman of it? Cuba. There's a group of 77, which is about 130 countries. Guess who's the chairman of it? Libya. The last 7 years have depleted so much our moral authority and attractiveness as a world leader in the UN that whoever is the next president will have to dig himself out of a very substantial hole, and the UN is not nearly as congenial a place as it was. I should also mention that one of the most powerful blocs in the UN is the Organization of the Islamic Conference, 60 members, not very friendly to us until we settle somehow on a basis of justice the Palestinian question. However, despite all this, there is a potential to use the UN for world and American interests. The challenges are still there for institution building. In one of his most notable speeches, and I close with this, Adlai reminded Americans that the UN is not a substitute for a strong defense, or for bilateral diplomacy, or for regional arrangements, but that it offers a uniquely valuable place for building institutions where global interests are involved and global cooperation is absolutely necessary. And as we face the challenges today of global warming, of ending deadly conflicts, of rebuilding Iraq as we withdraw, there's a role for the United Nations, also in achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And Adlai's vision, therefore, of constructive and realistic internationalism is more relevant than ever.
Thank you, Dick, very much for your very cogent remarks and for your very valuable assessment, particularly of the contribution at the United Nations. It's now my pleasure to turn to Felicity Yost, daughter of former Ambassador Charles W. Yost. She has served in the United Nations Secretariat's Office of Public Information since 1973. She has been a UN electoral observer in Namibia, in Haiti, Angola, El Salvador, and Mozambique. She was a co-author of the United Nations Study Group report, Suggestions for Personnel Reform, sponsored by the Carnegie Endowment. Felicity, it's your opportunity, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the three organizations who are hosting this venue. In my chapter, I write about the relationship between Adlai Stevenson and my father, Charles Yost, and their relationship with the United Nations. They first met in San Francisco, the city where the United Nations, as well as their friendship, began. Some back then at the San Francisco Founding Conference thought that the UN's charter had weaknesses. But from the start, both Stevenson and my father steadfastly believe that its principles, if adhered to, would serve as a powerful and thoughtful guide. Later, in 1961, Stevenson invited my father to become his deputy at the UN, and a formidable team was forged. It was a time when the world was dealing with numerous crises, and a time when the UN was regularly called on, often by the US, to intervene. Many of us here remember Adlai Stevenson confronting the Soviets in the Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We also may remember those were days when our UN ambassador developed the US position in consultation with the other members before going to the Security Council. This contrasts with our current style of going it alone, which has garnered few positive outcomes for the US or for the rest of the world. The UN's prospects continued to look dim, with some of our presidential candidates criticizing the UN, if they even bother to mention it, while some of them suggest replacing the UN with a league made up of only those nations that agree with the U.S. I can only imagine how appalled Stevenson and my father would be. Responding to attacks on the UN, they argued that the UN is not an independent entity, and yet it is often targeted when it is the member states who fail to act or who act dishonorably. Conversely, the UN rarely gets the credit when things go well. As one of the contributors to our book, Sir Brian Urquhart, said, "Who do people think ran the elections in Iraq, setting up the polling stations and providing the ballot and ballot boxes?" Stevenson often pointed out that without the UN's involvement, we risk ongoing conflict and chaos, or as he would say, what is the alternative? Though many organizations have sprung up since his time, I have found in my 35 years at the UN that it still commands enormous trust and respect in the field. Stevenson despaired that many Americans did not realize that for many parts of the world, the UN is effective, building, feeding, healing. While recognizing that the UN was not perfect, he believed that rather than abolish it, we should reform it, and rather than bypass it, we should strengthen it. And speaking of reform, I sometimes wonder, why do we speak of reforming the UN, but never of reforming the attitude and commitments of its members? In the area of peacekeeping, Stevenson and my father believed that only by having a standing mobile force could the Security Council effectively implement its mandate. Unfortunately, as I found on my 5 UN electoral missions, many of the most qualified nations do not participate in peacekeeping missions, and those countries that do often send poorly trained soldiers. The results, as we have seen far too often, can be catastrophic in ways that reflect disastrously on the UN. If the member states cooperated to speedily dispatch a well-trained professional force to extinguish a minor crisis, we might avoid dealing with a major disaster down the road. During Stevenson's tenure, the UN regularly put peacekeepers on the ground within 2 weeks. Needless to say, Darfur cries out for this kind of swift action. Plato wrote that one of the responsibilities of those engaged in diplomacy is a pedagogical one, a talent rarely called on and often derided these days. I think of Stevenson and my father, who lived their lives employing this honorable tradition, which offers both sides some degree of satisfaction without either side losing face. Stevenson and my father had a relationship that was remarkably devoid of ego, but was rather based on trust and respect. As such, their working alliance always benefited from the best that each could give. My own relationship with Adlai Stevenson flourished when he shared a summer house with our family. He and I would regularly swim out to a sandbar, which everyone seemed to understand was off limits to them. Conversations meandered from art to travel, but invariably ended with his request to get my dog to stop stealing his tennis balls. I close with the hope that the valuable institution that these two diplomats spent a lifetime preserving and protecting continues to be called on to meet the challenge launched by Ambassador Stevenson to Ambassador Zorn in the Security Council. Our job, Stevenson said, is to save the peace, and if you are ready to try, we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity, very much for reminding us of the Stevenson-Yost legacy at the United Nations and how cogent and important it is for us still today. It's now my pleasure to call on Ambassador Jim Goodby, a longtime, deeply experienced, recognized American expert on all facets of disarmament. Jim joined the U.S. Atomic Energy Agency Commission in 1954. In 1960s was officer in charge of nuclear test ban negotiations at the State Department and later at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. In 2000 and 2001, he was deputy to the Special Advisor to the President and the Secretary of State for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. He served as ambassador to Finland in 1980 and 81. He writes frequently on these subjects and is recognized as an expert and indeed as an authority by his friends, acquaintances, and many around the world who follow his writings carefully. Jim?
Tom, thank you very much for your introduction and for all the other nice words you had at the very beginning. I appreciate that very much. I found myself writing a blurb for a book I was involved in the other day, and I found myself writing, "He has been involved in nuclear weapons issues for 50 years." And I could hardly believe that, but it's true. I did get involved in those issues way back in 1954 when I joined the Atomic Energy Commission. I was inspired, I suppose, by Adlai Stevenson. And the words that come to my mind when I think about him and about his legacy are the same words that are on a plaque in a great building in London. I think it's St. Paul's Cathedral, designed by Christopher Wren, I believe. It says in Latin, "If you seek his monument, look around you." And I look around you, and you look at yourselves, and you're still here. Our buildings are still here, the city's still here, our country's still here. And that wasn't necessarily a given in 1956 when Adlai Stevenson suggested suspending tests of thermonuclear weapons. That was the depths of the Cold War. And those people who favored negotiations, who favored restraint in nuclear issues, were not very popular. After the collapse of the Truman effort to ban the bomb, the Baruch Plan, we fell into an arms race with the Soviet Union, and we were really in a very hot and heavy arms race at that point when Adlai Stevenson, in the spring of 1956, pointed to the dangers of thermonuclear testing, dangers to health, dangers to humanity, and the image that the United States presented to the world by detonating these huge explosions with enormous fallout. He was absolutely right in that. The first thermonuclear, one of the first thermonuclear explosions that we conducted was in March of 1954. It was larger, much larger than had been predicted by the scientists, including Edward Teller, who had designed the weapon. And the fallout extended well beyond the danger zone that had been established. A Japanese fisherman, more than one, was contaminated and killed by that. Strontium-90 then was something that was falling from the heavens every day because of these nuclear explosions. You probably don't have very much strontium-90 in your bones, but you probably have some. And Adlai Stevenson stopped that. What he did was highly unpopular, and what he said in the essay he's written, it appeared in Look magazine, 57, and he said he was struck by the curious ferocity of the attacks on his position, which is simply that we should suspend testing of this large category of thermonuclear weapons. And he was right, because anytime anyone begins to talk about limiting nuclear weapons, there is a curious ferocity that is brought to bear on those people who favor limitations. You saw it in the subsequent negotiations. You see it still today. What Adlai Stevenson did was set the course, I think, for those of us down the decades who have favored some kind of restraint in these nuclear issues. He was quickly emulated, and Judge Liebling pointed this out. Within a year of the time he was being excoriated by Richard Nixon, who called it catastrophic nonsense, I was in London in 1957 on a delegation negotiating arms control with the Soviet Union and others, and we were then beginning to talk about a test ban. So within a year, actually, the idea became current in negotiations. The following year, 1958, we began a serious negotiation on the means of monitoring a test ban. And Eisenhower, in 58, in October of that year, just 2 years later, declared a moratorium on all testing, not just thermonuclear, which lasted until 1961. Eisenhower went out of office without succeeding in getting a test ban, but by the time he had come to an end of his office, he was an ardent supporter of it. Had the U-2 incident not occurred, had he been able to go to the Soviet Union as had been planned, the test ban would have been number one item on the agenda. There might, in fact, have been an agreement, not to be. Kennedy, as somebody has already said, sort of picked up these ideas and made them his own. And I would give Kennedy great credit because he very clearly and firmly let everybody know in his administration that he wanted to have a test ban, a comprehensive test ban. He persevered in that. He was strongly supported by Harold Macmillan, then the British Prime Minister. I've heard Kennedy say one time that he wanted to be good at follow-through on this test ban issue because Harold Macmillan had told him that Eisenhower wasn't very good at follow-through. And Kennedy did do that. Even when it was clear that Khrushchev had decided in 1961 that this guy, Kennedy, was a pushover, built the Berlin Wall and so forth, and obviously had other plans than a nuclear test ban at that point in time, Kennedy still persevered. And finally, because of verification problems, the best he could do was to get a limited test ban treaty not long before he died. And that treaty, by the way, our moderator, Tom Pickering, was one of the primary drafters of it. He gave some credit to me, but I give it back to him because he, in fact, was one of the chief authors of this treaty, which is still in force today, and was the first treaty that affected nuclear weapons in any serious way. There had been a hotline agreement prior to that, but the only time that there was any kind of restraint on nuclear weapons up to that time was in that limited test ban treaty of 1963. In the footsteps of Kennedy, Johnson also supported a not only a test ban treaty, but tried to get beyond that, tried to have limitations on strategic forces. First time that had been tried. Nixon and Kissinger followed through on that. By the time Reagan came into office, Reagan was one of the, I have to agree with what I think Obama said the other day, that in fact Reagan was a transformational president in the sense that in this field, in arms control, he turned away from the idea of simply controlling stability as between the United States and the Soviet Union, said let's go for elimination if we possibly can do it. And from that point on, the trend has in fact been downwards. Today, were Adlai Stevenson alive, I think he would be one of those that is calling, as some are in this country, for a return to the idea of eliminating nuclear weapons. I don't know how many of you have seen these articles, but in the Wall Street Journal on January 4th, 2007, and again in the Wall Street Journal on January 15 of this year, George Shultz, Reagan's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, Clinton's Secretary of Clinton's Secretary of Defense, and Senator Sam Nunn, former chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, have come out very strongly in favor of a serious effort to eliminate nuclear weapons, and they've laid out steps that will show how you get there. This is the kind of stance that I think Adlai Stevenson pioneered, the kind of alternative to preventive war, to a continuous arms race that he stood for. And it's that strain in American political life that I think we have to look back at and honor Adlai Stevenson for creating, for getting it all started. He was there first. I think that today is nonpartisan or bipartisan agreement that probably the most serious national security problem we face is the problem of terrorism armed with nuclear weapons, because that is the case where we could see Washington and New York disappear overnight if one of these people managed to acquire, through theft or some other way, a nuclear device. The idea of simply limiting nuclear weapons, I think, is inadequate to that kind of problem. I think that probably that's what Adlai Stevenson would feel today. So I honor his memory. I ask you to think about his legacy and try to apply it to today's issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, very much. I can't help but comment that your remarks remind us that the test ban was an idea that was beginning to achieve currency 50 years ago, this last year. Were Adlai Stevenson alive today, I think he would consider it a travesty that this country has not ratified yet the comprehensive test ban. I hope very much that in the next 12 months we will see an administration which is prepared to take on that task.
Right.
Thank you, Jim. My pleasure and honor is to call on Dr. John Bradamus as the cleanup hitter today. John, as you all know, is President Emeritus of New York University, whereas he served as president in 1981 and 82. He brought a regional commuter institution into a national and international research university. In 55 and 56, he was executive assistant to Adlai Stevenson in charge of research on issues during the governor's second presidential campaign. A Hoosier, along with Lee Hamilton, Dr. Bradamus served as U.S. Representative in Congress for 22 years. His last 4 years as House Majority Whip. He has been active and either chair or member of almost everything that went on in New York in arts and sciences and education, and from Spain to Argentina. So, John, please, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I count it a real honor to be here, and there are several reasons. One is that as a member of Congress, I helped write the law that created the Woodrow Wilson Center and was for a time on the advisory council of the center. And I have immense respect for its leader, Lee Hamilton, my fellow Hoosier, a modern American statesman in the tradition of Adlai Stevenson. I should add that my late mother also told me when I was a child how she had campaigned for Woodrow Wilson for President of the United States, so I have yet another reason to feel empathy. I'm glad to be here with such eminent diplomats as Jim Goodby and Tom Pickering, and I want to congratulate Judge Liebling for his extraordinary tenacity of purpose in putting this volume together. Of course, I'm glad to see my friend of many years, Senator Adlai Stevenson, and I draw particular attention to Dick Gardner. Dick and I were both students at Harvard and at Oxford, so we go back a very long way. And when I was going to Madrid to raise money for the King Juan Carlos of Spain Center at NYU, Dick was my host at the embassy. When I see Felicity Yost and realize that she'd been a servant of the UN, I recall that it was in the summer of 1949, when I was a student at Harvard, that I was an intern at the United Nations when it was then at Lake Success, and Trygve Lie was the Secretary General. I worked in the section for NGOs of the Department of Public Information. As for the subject that brings us together, let me explain my own connection to the governor. In 1952, while a student at Oxford, on the eve of the presidential election in the United States that year, I joined several other Americans to put on a mock national convention at Rhodes House, where I nominated Adlai Ewing Stevenson for President of the United States. And I also wrote for a student journal at Oxford an essay entitled Why I'm Voting Democratic in November, in which I sharply criticized the candidacy of Dwight Eisenhower, praised Stevenson, and went so far as to predict a Democratic victory. So politically intense was I, and so greatly did I admire Stevenson, that I had reprints of my article made and sent to, among others, William McCormick Blair, Jr., the Chicago attorney who was Stevenson's law partner and close associate. Only 8 months after leaving Oxford in the summer of '53 and returning to my hometown of South Bend, Indiana, I became the Democratic nominee from Indiana's then 3rd District for election in 1954 to the House of Representatives. I was just 26 when I announced my candidacy. I won the congressional nomination. On September 1854, I attended a dinner in Indianapolis to kick off the Democratic congressional campaign. I took a tape recorder with me, and I secured endorsements for use on radio from the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, and the titular leader of the Democratic Party, the presidential nominee in '52, Adlai Stevenson. I lost my first race for Congress with 49.5% of the total vote, a margin of some 2,000 votes to the incumbent Republican. A third candidate, you may be amused to learn, of the Prohibition Party, won 700 votes. Having come close to victory in my initial plunge into politics, I naturally decided to run again in '56. I thought it a good idea to get some experience in Washington. I came here, worked for a senator and for a congressman. And then a few months later, Bill Blair telephoned me, recalling my early enthusiasm for Adlai Stevenson. He said the governor was going to run for president again in '56 and asked me to come to Chicago to take charge of organizing volunteers for Stevenson across the country. I said, I'm flattered, but I'm not the right person for that. You better get somebody who had worked in the first campaign and so has a network of contacts. Blair agreed, but he said there's another position in the campaign that might interest me, and that's to be executive assistant to Governor Stevenson in charge of research on issues. I said, that's for me. And so I would in Chicago be less than 2 hours from my home congressional district in South Bend. And that assignment led to one of the most fascinating and valuable years of my life. I worked in the Stevenson office in the Continental Illinois Bank building with Bill Blair, W. Willard Wirtz, and Newton Minow, whose names have been earlier mentioned. And in addition to developing position papers for Stevenson, I served as liaison at the direction of Wirtz and former Air Force Secretary Tom Finletter in New York with Stevenson's Brain Trust, his policy advisors, which included such persons as John Kenneth Galbraith, Seymour Harris, Arthur Schlesinger, all of Harvard, Kerry Brown and Paul Samuelson of MIT, Richard Musgrave of the University of Michigan, and Joe Rao, the Washington lawyer. I served on the Stevenson staff from the summer of '55 through the August '56 Democratic Convention in Chicago, chaired by my political godfather, Paul Butler, a South Bend lawyer. After the convention, I went back to South Bend in my own campaign for Congress, but such was the attractiveness of Eisenhower at the top of the Republican ticket that he defeated Stevenson by a larger margin in '56 than '52, and I was caught in the Eisenhower sweep. So both Stevenson and Bradamus lost a second time. I thought, well, here I am, not yet 30, twice defeated for Congress. There has been before you get started. But it was not until my third campaign in '58, when Democrats won 49 new seats in the House, that I was first elected and then 10 times reelected. So I served for 22 years. I was in my 12th term, seeking my 12th term, defeated in Reagan's landslide over Carter, and was shortly thereafter invited to become president of New York University, the largest private university in our country, a position in which I served until 1992, when I became President Emeritus, my present responsibility. But I must say that Stevenson's example of political leadership I took as a model, one that contributed in serious fashion to my own commitments as a member of Congress and at New York University and in other positions of responsibility. I cite just two examples to make my point. I shared Adlai Stevenson's keen interest in international affairs. I am the son of a Greek immigrant. I'm the first Greek American elected to Congress to the Congress House or Senate. I studied abroad with Dick Gardner and traveled while a student at Oxford. And then in Congress, I traveled widely to many countries of the world. And at New York University, I established particularly important to me, the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center. I did my PhD at Oxford on the anarchist movement in Spain. And in 1983, I gave an honorary degree to the King. And in 1997, just 10 years ago, in the presence of the King and Queen Sophia, his Greek queen, and of the then First Lady of the United States, Hillary Rodham Clinton, I dedicated the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center, where I make my office. I made a speech a few years ago in Rabat, Morocco, and said that I thought most Americans didn't know very much about Islam, and that some American universities should establish centers for the study of Islam, and we have now done that. I learned on arrival of the gift of the widow of Eric Mariah Remarque, all quiet on the Western Front, to New York University. So I went, of his library, I went to call on her to say thank you. That was Paulette Goddard, the actress. And a result of that conversation was a gift that made possible the establishment of a Center for the Study of Europe in his name. We also have a Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimo. We have a Center for U.S.-Japan Business and Economic Studies. So I continue this interest in international studies. Indeed, I was the author of the International Education Act of 1966 to provide federal grants to colleges and universities for the study of other countries, a measure President Johnson signed into law, but Congress failed to appropriate money to implement, and I argue that not for that reason alone, but that ignorance of the histories, languages, cultures of other countries is one of the reasons that the United States has got into so much trouble in various parts of the world. The second point I would like to make is that Adlai Stevenson, and by the way, that Adlai Stevenson elevated the concept of the vocation of politics. He made it an honorable calling. And having myself now worked for a presidential nominee, having myself run for Congress often, and having served in Congress with 6 presidents of the United States, I recall here how Sam Rayburn was once asked, Mr. Speaker, under how many presidents did you serve? Rayburn, under none. I like that answer. I served with 6, 3 Republicans, Eisenhower, Nixon, and Ford, and 3 Democrats, Kennedy, Johnson, and Carter. And because this is a family occasion, I shall not comment on the current occupant of the White House. I decided to establish 2 or 3 years ago a center at New York University in the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, a center which bears my name, for the study of the Congress of the United States, of Congress as a policy-making institution. I remind you that in our separation of powers system, unlike a parliamentary system, Congress has power to make policy independently of the executive branch. If a senator or a representative is skillful, knows what he or she is doing, and if the political forces at the time make action possible, that senator or congressman can, without picking up the telephone to call the White House, write the laws of the land. And I did, and others did. But with 100 senators and 435 representatives, and lacking the party discipline characteristic of European parliamentary systems, it is very difficult for even informed Americans like those in this room, even also I have observed for some presidents, to understand Congress. And therefore we have established this center at New York University to focus on illuminating both public and scholarly understanding of how the Congress of the United States makes national policy. And so we conduct lectures and symposia on the processes by which Congress makes policy and important issues of policy. I regard this effort as very much in line with the commitment that Adlai Stevenson represented to active participation in democratic governance, both with a small d and a large d. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, John. The esteem in this room with which Indiana holds Illinois, and Illinois seems to reciprocate, is, in my view, a very strong recognition of Governor Stevenson's universal appeal. I'm acutely conscious of the fact that 5 to 7 minutes is a highly elastic concept in this town. I'm also acutely conscious of the fact that we are going to end at 4 o'clock, and that perhaps because you have been a kind, patient, and listening audience, that no longer should you be solely talked to, but that you may have an opportunity to speak to us. And rather than to have a colloquy among members of the panel, I'd like to jump into audience participation immediately. And you may, if you would, address a question to any person here that you would like, or to the panel as a whole, and I will manage, obviously, to prod and push to get you answers. Members in the panel may comment on questions as they see fit. I ask only if you would raise your hand to be recognized, and when recognized, would you please stand and state your name and your affiliation. Please, right down here, sir. I think you can wait for the microphone so the rest of us can hear.
David Harris, retired academic. I'd like to address this question to Adlai Stevenson. I'd be interested to know your father's favorite authors outside the sphere of politics.
Oh. Well, to tell the truth, he was not an omnivorous reader. So I tried to say earlier, he was studying on the ground, often at the front lines. I remember from childhood being read to at night. Sir Walter Scott, literature, Kipling. He was, I think, reading as much to us for the literature as it was for the world. But this was not a life that had much time for reading, and he took, unlike, I think some of you know this from your own experience, unlike politicians with auto pens like I used to have, he really took his communications with his friends and his supporters, his admirers, very seriously. It was an enormous, you saw it, Dick, body of personal correspondence. He was hearing from people. They were sending him memoranda, articles, books. I don't know how to answer that. I'm not sure there is an answer to favorite authors. But it wouldn't have been fiction. It was history, the world, from the beginning.
A gentleman over here on the aisle, would you please wait for the microphone?
Colonel Datta, Foreign Policy Association. My question is for Mr. Richard Gardner. I was also the aide to the President of India and very much interested in the politics. The 1947, world saw the division of the Indian subcontinent into two countries, and then they went to war. And I think Mr. Adlai Stevenson was very much in the seat in the United Nations. What was his private views on Kashmir war?
Kashmir.
Well, now, Adlai Stevenson was ambassador from 1961 to 65. Now, which conflict took place on his watch between India and Pakistan? I think there was a war under Arthur Goldberg's watch, but I don't believe it was under Stevenson's. Yeah. Yes.
But
Yeah.
is it possible to throw a light on his views on Kashmir problem?
That's too hard for me. I really.
Or any one of the panelists?
All I can remember is him coming back from Kashmir. The travels never stopped, and talking about the Vale of Kashmir. Coming back from Pakistan with a pistol, which is a perfect replica of a Colt, and talking about the Pushtun, the Punjabis, and what a militant people there were. But I can't answer the question.
Right in the back here, third row from the back, please.
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm with the PBGC. Governor Stevenson was the last Democrat nominated in a convention that went beyond one ballot. My question to anyone who wishes to answer is, in this did he have any qualms about this world of party bosses, or did he express views that were later fulfilled by the McGovern Commission about how Democrats should select a president?
Well, mea culpa. I was a member of the McGovern Commission, which, as you know, was created after the 1968 convention in Chicago, at which I was also a delegate. I think I was then state treasurer. But this followed my father's death in 1965. In my own book, which I hope will appear one of these days, I suggest that, maybe in our efforts to democratize the democratic process, we overdid it and created something of a plutocracy instead of a democracy. Our founders created, very conscious of the frailties of democracy, which you can trace back to Periclean Athens, created a representative form of government. The old conventions were a representative form of government. My first was 1948. I was a sergeant at arms beneath the rostrum, and that was a convention of politicians assembled. It was hot and muggy and smelly, tobacco smoke everywhere, no air conditioning. And I was supposed to keep the aisles cleared of all those rumpled senators and governors. And I remember an unknown young mayor of Minneapolis getting recognition and challenging those politicians to rise up and adopt a strong civil rights plank. That young mayor was elected that year to the Senate the same year my father was elected. He was later my first seatmate in the United States Senate. That was Hubert Humphrey. But that was a convention. All of the great presidents, or let me confine it to the Democratic Party, all of the great Democratic candidates, the Democratic presidents, were candidates of conventions. So I think we've gone a little bit too far. How much money will get invested in this cycle? $1 billion? Can you imagine my father even seeking the office? I asked Bill Wirtz this morning, would he spend 2-3 years, state to state, pandering to every local interest, just hands out, raising, what have they raised already? $130 million? He didn't have to raise a penny to get nominated in 1952. He entered 3 primaries in 56. There wouldn't have been 3 except the Republicans poured over and voted for Kefauver in Minnesota, and they finally got it resolved in the California primary that year. So, no, he never saw this. And I never heard him complain about the old politics. And this is one of the reasons we're organizing this center, to try to get our hands around this situation. No other developed democracy tolerates this. The money, the duration, the lobby, the influence of the interest groups, the ignorance of the people. No. We could have survived it maybe 40 years ago, but in this world, I'm not sure. So you're hearing from me, but not from my father. But I think I know how he'd feel if he were witnessing this.
Thank you, Senator. Just down here in front, please.
My name is Morris Wolf. I'm fortunate to be a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and I really thank Congressman Bradamus, others for the comments they made, not only about the Institute, but about our leader, Lee Hamilton, who is truly one of the exceptional human beings that I've ever met. I had been an assistant to John Sherman Cooper during the Civil Rights Act of 1964 debates, which was a great moment to be with Hubert Humphrey and other great people. The question I have is this. In 1952, Adlai Stevenson had an incredible ability to attract the interest of young human beings to get involved in politics. I believe at that time I was a 10th or 11th grader in high school, and I happened to see the headquarters downtown. I walked in, I saw the literature. Then I got to meet him at Convention Hall when he gave this speech, and he was so down to earth and so unpretentious and so clear and so bright that I had the same feeling of Congressman Bradamus. This is a man I want to be associated with. So I got involved. I volunteered. I worked like crazy the whole campaign. I cried the night of the loss, and then went on and got very interested in John F. Kennedy as well. And now we have this young man, Barack Obama, who has attracted the interest of young people. My question is this, not to get into partisan politics for 1 minute, but what was there about Governor Stevenson? Was he fully aware of how he did attract this young generation? Was he aware that he was really appealing with this idea of vision and hope, or was this just one of the things that happened along the way?
I don't think it was just the young people. I know that one of the great satisfactions of his life was involving good people in our politics, not just the young. Some of the young are here, or they were young, but you could see it in his relations with with young people, the children of his friends. It was he took an interest in these young people. Some of them, their lives were created by his example and by his personal interest. He was almost a father to some of these young people. But I do know that involving people of all ages in our political process actively was a source of enormous satisfaction to him. It wasn't an end in itself. It was something that happened, and was very encouraging to him. And to say today, to see them dropping out would be very discouraging.
May I also...
Felicity, and then Judge Liebling. Make sure you all have a chance to comment.
I wanted to add to this because when I knew Ambassador Stevenson, I was a young person. And he had this ability, this gift, to kind of wrap you up and bundle you off and focus on you. And he was one of the first adults who made me feel like an adult. My opinions were of great interest to him, which didn't mean that he didn't argue with me. That was part of what made me feel like an adult. He wasn't just saying, "Oh, well, that's great, and you're doing the right thing." Well, what about this and what about that? And he didn't mind, which was of great joy for me. He didn't mind leaving all the adults behind in a reception or whatever and just taking me off and ignoring everybody else. Well, this for a child was just...
Felicity, there's one of the chapters in this book is by Adele Simmons, who is saying, had that experience, and it really shaped her life. It's a beautiful article.
Judge.
A daughter of a friend.
Adlai Stevenson loved people, and he loved his sons, and he loved young people, and I saw it when a whole host of people, college students, were supported him for governor throughout the state. And when we would, as young people would do, be off by ourselves and start laughing and so on and so forth, and he'd interrupt right in the middle of whatever he was doing and come out, as Don Campbell says in his prologue, and want to participate. And Don said that since I had a hearty laugh about things, that I made him laugh. That's rather unique, because he made so many other people laugh. And
if I can interrupt you, Brian Urquhart, one of the authors in this book, remarked the other day, apropos what the judge just said, he could even make Andre Gromyko laugh.
So you see, that I could make this man laugh was, to me, one of the great accomplishments. He inspired so many people. I was one of the people, probably many, many faces in this room, to do enormous things. He represented principles and thoughts. And today we're seeing a sparkling again of this idea in a candidate. My own personal perception is that people are looking for a change. Today we decided to contest the interest of other people in the Great Tuesday election, and you're all here. And tonight we'll see if people want the kind of change that you're talking about, what kind of change. But I think that, yes, Adlai Stevenson was a young man. He always is a young man at heart. And people saw it, and they responded to it.
Please, in the fourth row, sir. Third in.
Gary Filerman, Georgetown University. This is a segue to a story which I sure has never been told, because I was there. The Leamington Hotel, Minneapolis, 1956. Very late one night, midnight or so, following one of those dreadful open parties for reporters and hangers-on, and in a large hall, smelled of smoke and liquor. Everybody's finally gone, and there are 4 or 5 of us in the corner who were the grunts of the campaign. And the governor walked in. It was about midnight, in a robe and slippers. And he said, "I can't sleep." And he began by drawing us out. Who were we? What were we doing there? Asking us about ourselves. And then he said something like, "I didn't do very well today, did I?" And he began to pull out from us comments, and it was very clear that he was down. He was feeling down. And it led to a conversation, this went on for an hour or so, about young people entering politics. And he said there are 2 paths. You either work your way up by slugging it out from the ranks of the party up, or you become prominent in something else and move over. And he said, today I'm not sure I wouldn't recommend that everybody move over. Very revealing.
Comments on that? Anyone?
Well,
Senator.
He said once that he was born with an incurable hereditary case of politics. And he did move over. His first office was for governor of Illinois. But when I determined to start at the bottom and prove myself, he did not protest. I started as a precinct worker and worked my way up through the legislature to state treasurer to the senator, and then 2 runs for the Democratic candidate for governor. I think he rather approved of that process, but he certainly would not have disapproved people working their way up in science and I think I'll hesitate a little on business, but in academia, in the law, moving lateral. Remember in the old days, the revolving door was a source of great strength in this country. He was a part of it as a New Deal bureaucrat. They'd go back and forth. The law firms, the businesses would benefit, the government would benefit. Now we try to make it illegal because of the cultural change. So I think in his day, it wouldn't have mattered a whole lot, just so long as you got involved and were the right kind of person.
Sir, back here in the middle.
Yes, I'm Stan Carson, and I had another question which I will ask, but in a sequel to the discussion I had a minute ago about his affinity and the mutual feeling of affection for young people in Adlai Stevenson.
In March of 1952, there was a big dinner, a Democratic dinner here in Washington. I think it was a Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner. And he was coming as a guest and a speaker. But at the time, he was being followed viciously by the press because his name was being bandied around as a possible candidate, and he was trying to resist that draft. To avoid the press that night, he came to a party that I was giving for Young Democrats. I had just been elected head of the Young Democrats of Washington, having defeated the Southerners who had dominated the Democrats here in Washington for a long time. And he came because Dick Nelson, who was one of his staff, was the national president of Young Democrats at the time. So he came to a group of young Democrats, spent an hour with us, and then went on at the very last minute to the Democratic dinner, and did avoid the press, but not for long. And I worked on his staff, that is, as a junior staff member, and I just learned tonight, this afternoon, from John Bradamus, that he was asked to, first of all, by Bill Blair to come to Illinois in 1955 to work for Volunteers for Stevenson, and declined to do that. And I guess Bill must have followed up by asking me to do the same thing right after that. So I want to thank you, John. At any rate, in 1960, I was one of the small band of diehards that was still trying to get Adlai Stevenson nominated for president. Didn't succeed. I would like to ask whoever feels that they could answer this very sensitive question. What was Adlai Stevenson's feeling about John F. Kennedy as a candidate for president on the Democratic ticket and as president?
Well, I'll
You'll take a shot at it.
I'll take a shot. I think he had the, really the highest regard for John F. Kennedy. And I remember at the 1956 campaign, or convention, when he threw open the selection of the vice presidential candidate to the convention. We had, this is at the Stockyards Inn, the convention was in Chicago, and I was in his suite when the balloting started for vice president. We were all rooting for John F. Kennedy. In fact, at one point, I ran downstairs to Kennedy's suite where Sergeant Shriver was throwing up a barricade, and Kennedy was pulling up his trousers to go down to the convention floor to accept the nomination, and congratulated, we always called him Jack Kennedy, ran back upstairs to watch Kefauver get the nomination. And we were, of course, it was the best thing that could have happened for Kennedy. He would have been implicated in a failed campaign for the presidency. For John F. Kennedy, I think there was always a great deal of respect. At moments, some impatience. He was very disappointed not to have been nominated, appointed Secretary of State. And I heard him say, if I was qualified in March, when they were trying to get me to support them, why aren't I qualified now to be Secretary of State? The difficulties that have been alluded to and he campaigned vigorously all over the country in that 1960 campaign for. And as somebody mentioned, also he had responsibility for the transition papers on foreign policy. But there were others around Kennedy who politically viewed him as a threat, as sort of a competitor, a contender, because he was so popular. People were literally by the thousands breaking into that 1960 convention to demand another nomination for. So some around him always were a little hostile, a little fearful, and did occasionally some mean-spirited things. I remember at the 1960 inauguration of John F. Kennedy, at the Capitol, after the swearing in, the limousines pulled up for each of the members of the cabinet, except for one. My father was a member of the cabinet, but his limousine was missing. Of course, it didn't work for these guys. He walked. He went down the parade route behind the limousines, and the crowds on both sides cheered. Governor without a limousine, walking. There was what used to be known as the Irish Mafia. There were a few individuals who I will not name that were always a little, fearful. But I think as between my father and John F. Kennedy, there was a real affinity. And of course, Jackie, every time she needed to escape the Kennedys or get out of Washington, you know where she went? Yeah. To New York, to go to the theater. There was a real affinity there too. I think he had, and I remember after the assassination, his lamentations, his blaming himself, because he had been to Dallas and been attacked physically by a woman with a placard. He incidentally was asked by the police then, did he want her charged, prosecuted? He said, no, I want her educated. But he lamented afterwards that he really should have warned the White House that there was a poisonous attitude in Dallas, and tried to prevent the president from going on that fatal trip. Some of the other differences have been mentioned, but I think as between him and John F. Kennedy, there's a great deal of respect. And as Kennedy once called him a national treasure or something, that it was reciprocated, but it was not easy because there were a lot of others involved.
Judge?
The corollary to what your question was, I think, is, well, if that were the case, then why didn't he support more openly Kennedy in 1960? Why did he take this ambivalent, unexplained position? Well, he thought he was clear. He left the country. I see Edison Dick in the audience, and I covered this in a note where I quoted from his mother saying, well, why hadn't Stevenson issued a Sherman-like statement nonetheless? And she said he went through a number of heartbreaks, and he felt loyalty to people was extraordinary, and his loyalty to his supporters was enormous. Eleanor Roosevelt, he just couldn't let her down. She felt the way she did. And if you have a second, the story that was told to me was that Eleanor rode up in an elevator in the building where the nominating process, or the supporting process, and somebody who took her up in the elevator to talk to Richard Daley, try to convince him to support Stevenson, who he'd worked with. And he said to her, Eleanor, or Mrs. Roosevelt, you know that Richard Daley is going to support Jack Kennedy. She says, I know, but I've got to see him. I've got to talk to him because this has to be done. Well, this kind of loyalty showed itself up in so many different categories. I mean, the woman was out campaigning left and right in 1956, and to many people in this audience, I suppose there was that interrelationship. He just couldn't let people down. This is what your mother felt, was the explanation. He did this at enormous risk because, as Newt Minow said in various categories, Kennedy came out to visit the governor, and he and Bill Blair, I think it was, brought him out to your house.
I was there.
You were there. And Newt asked him, why are you coming here? He says, I'd like to find out if your father would like to be Secretary of State. And Newt said apparently at the time, I don't think I would ask him that question. He said, well, why not? He says, he's in a position where he just couldn't respond to it. So, and when he came out of the meeting, he said, well, did you ask the governor about it? And he said, no, he didn't. He says, why not? He said, you told me not to. Well, the father didn't take it quite so sanguinely or that way, and I think a number of other people, probably Bobby, and they didn't quite forgive him for not giving the full support, even though he went out afterwards and campaigned, what, 100 speeches, was it, Adlai?
Well, he was also the titular leader of the party. And
Yeah.
He felt that he had an obligation to be neutral.
But he was with cross emotions, and this loyalty and this feeling, and there were several people vying. So he put himself, as he did in this nuclear issue, on the line. He was going to do what he thought was the right thing, regardless of what. Thank God he was appointed by the president as ambassador to the United Nations. And he was there at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I, as a lawyer, look at how he responded in that debate, which was impromptu. I mean, this wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't something that you fellows in the State Department gave him as a piece of literature to read. It was his response, the right response, with the right tonal quality, and with what else was going on in the administration, including Kennedy and the brother and so on and so forth. We avoided a Holocaust because, well, there were hydrogen bombs sitting over there at the time, and you didn't know, Jim, that was the case. And they had the authority, I think you said, to initiate those bombs without seeking Russian approval, wasn't it?
Going back to Moscow.
And they were being, we saw at the U-2 that they were capable of being launched. So, this is a man who knew the right thing to say and participated in a program, and we avoided and we're here today. So, can we be thankful for that? Newt Minow says millions of young children, born and unborn, can be thankful for that man at that time, and he was there.
I'm going to take the last question here, and I see one hand, so you have it.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent Writers Hub. To anyone having an opinion, how have you evaluated some of the most recent UN ambassadors and from the United States? And were there any worthy successors to Adlai Stevenson in representing the United States to the world?
Want a quote from your card?
May I?
Dick will take it.
May I speak to that? Look, the finest ambassador to the UN since Adlai is sitting right over there. Right over there. The job that Tom Pickering did in the first Gulf War in getting the votes in the UN and the support from the international community, that is one of the great untold stories of modern diplomacy. Really. No one has equaled him in that since his tenure. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about John Bolton, who actually has been on record as saying there's no such thing as international law. It's just something that's dreamed up by our opponents to limit our freedom of action. But let me say something nice about someone in the administration. I know I'll lose all my friends here, but that I have had a chance to meet in the last days Ambassador Khalilzad. I can't pronounce his name exactly. The current ambassador to the UN, who is Khalilzad, who is an Afghan American, and he is making a real attempt to change the Bolton approach, and he has met with the Security Council, I think in good faith, to encourage a greater UN role in Iraq. And indeed, we have a UN representative in Iraq right now, Stefan de Mistura, an old friend of mine, who is working to get the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds to work out a deal on Kirkuk, on the sharing of the oil wealth and all that. And it's partly because we got a UN ambassador finally who sees that if we wish to disengage, we've got to get some help from the international community, and the UN can play a role. So I just want to leave the sense that we may slowly, laboriously go back to the Stevenson-Pickering concept of how to do that job in New York.
Thank you, Dick, very much for your very kind words. A little bit of hyperbole goes a long way, but I'm grateful. I share your high view of Ambassador Khalilzad, and I think he's doing a tremendous job, and I think we all need to get behind him in the work he's trying to do. I now, as moderator, want to thank all of the participants, all the members of the panel, and those who came early to introduce the subject. We're deeply grateful for your coming. I think this is a significant review of the legacy of Adlai Stevenson, his tremendous contribution. You cannot leave the room today without understanding that this was an extraordinary man whose work and whose life lives on in many, many ways and in many facets of what we're doing, and we are, I think, all deeply grateful for that. I've been asked to remind the audience that there is a reception following the event on this same floor. I'm sure there will be people who will help direct you there, and once again asked to remind you that if you would like a copy of this book, and